Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Keeping Up with COVID-19, Practical Pointers for Business Owners to Navigate the Pandemic. My name is Mike Camarata. I will be moderating today's webinar. I am the second vice chair for this great chamber, Central Maryland Chamber. I am also a partner at a local financial planning firm called Tide Creek Financial Group, which is located in Elkridge, Maryland. The Central Maryland Chamber is here to support you during this crisis. We have a resource page on our website with up-to-the-minute information on COVID-19 at www.centralmarylandchamber.org. This is right on the landing page. When you go there, you will find a list of businesses who are open and operating, along with upcoming and past webinars that you can view. If you are not yet a member of the Central Maryland Chamber, you can also find information about membership there. Please sign up for our newsletter on the website and follow us on social media for more information. This webinar will be recorded and distributed to attendees following the event. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box. If we have time, we will touch on those that have not been answered at the end. This time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. You want to go to the next slide?
I'm trying. There we go. We may jump forward a few times. I'll take us back if we do.
So today's speakers are Veronica Yu and Kelsey Longacre from Alfick Kerman. Veronica's practice focuses on employment counseling for businesses and litigation. Veronica has experience counseling business owners with regards to their employment-related questions and concerns, including drafting employment policies, navigating the employer-employee relationship, and conducting internal investigations of employee complaints relating to discrimination and harassment. Veronica also has extensive litigation experience representing businesses with their employment and business-related claims. Veronica is barred in both Maryland and the District of Columbia. Ms. Longacre's primary areas of concentration include general corporate advising, administrative hearings, state and federal appellate litigation. She advises startups and small businesses during all stages of the business's life cycle. She regularly drafts organizational documents, reviews commercial leases, negotiates franchising agreements, and assists with the sale of corporate entities. She represents clients before state and county agencies in their applications for new licenses, transfers of existing licenses, or defense of challenged licenses. She also handles land use and zoning matters, real property transactions, and homeowners association matters. Ms. Longacre is a past president of the Howard County Bar Association, the former representative for Howard County on the Maryland State Bar Association's Board of Governors, and the former chair of James McGill American Inns of Court. Now, I am very excited for today's webinar because I myself am a business owner and I have a ton of questions in terms of opening back up and what to do. I'm also grateful that I am moderating because today is the first time that I've worn something other than gym clothes, knowing that I was going to be on camera. So with that said, I will let the two of you get started.
Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Mike. Kelsey and I are excited to be here, and thank you for the Central Maryland Chamber and all of you for joining us today. So keeping up with COVID-19, Kelsey and I chose this topic because it kind of feels like it's what we're all trying to do today. Can we keep up with the news? Can we keep up with the law and all of the guidance that's coming out on a daily basis? And it can certainly be overwhelming. So we want to try to provide an overview of practical pointers that you can use throughout this time, even for things to look back on the past, what you can do now, and how you can continue as the developments with the pandemic unfold. So a lot has happened since January 31, when COVID-19 was officially declared a public health emergency. And I've heard countless times, I can't believe it's May, how did we get here? So I do think it makes sense to look back where we've come from to determine where we're going. So It's also like a complete understatement to say that these changes have quickly changed how we do business and are really impacting the decisions that business owners are making. You know, in March, we had Maryland declare a state of emergency on March 5th. We saw a majority of businesses have to close due to the governor's mandates. We also saw the passage of the Families First Act and the CARES Act. And all of us were trying to understand, what does this mean? In April, we continue to see businesses adjust to what we like to call the new normal, working from home, applying for unemployment, and trying to navigate those two big federal legislations that were passed and getting funding. We also were told to stay at home and ordered to wear face mask coverings in public. So all of these changes it demonstrates how fast moving the pandemic has been and how we really have to be informed so we can react appropriately. You know, everything that we've gone through thus far has been very daunting, but understanding where we've come will really provide the foundation for how we plan for our next steps.
All right, so one of the first things that we think is a good practical pointer is, while you're in the middle of this, take time to stop and evaluate yourself and your business. There's nothing quite like an emergency situation for you to suddenly realize the things that aren't working appropriately for you. So the first thing that I'm telling clients to do is to evaluate the bottlenecks. You know, is it the government shutdown that's the problem for you right now? Is it that your supplier is shut down? Is it that you can't get things to the people that are expecting you to provide those services or those goods? So if you can identify where you're currently having difficulties, you can figure out ways to work around it, and hopefully look at your contracts and see how you can use those to your advantage, or where you need to negotiate your contracts so that you can change what your responsibilities are at the moment, or look and see if you need to go to a different third-party vendor because your current vendor can't, you know, fulfill their responsibilities for you. I think one of the big things that everybody's been talking about lately and nobody really understands is this concept of force majeure, which is basically the layman's term is an act of God. It's normally used for events like tornadoes, hurricanes, other things that you see that happen where an area has been impacted and is shut down temporarily. If you can't act under a force majeure clause, typically you're given an out. Both sides are given an out. So you're not held to fulfill the duties of your contract that you would otherwise need to fulfill. It's a big question right now. A lot of contracts are not designed to take a pandemic into consideration as to whether or not that is an act of God. And there have been some rumblings and indications from, you know, various people that their contracts, especially their contracts with their insurance providers, don't cover the pandemic as a force majeure issue. It specifically excludes pandemics. So people may not be able to get out of whatever their duties are under that contract, or they may not be able to seek any sort of help using that clause. There is this concept of impossibility of performance under the civil law. So if you go to court and you say there's no way we could have performed, it was impossible, then you may be able to get out of that agreement. But it's a lot easier for you to be able to point to a clause in advance and deal with it then, instead of having to litigate over it.
So Kelsey, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
What should you do if your insurance company says they don't cover pandemic related claims?
I think the first thing to do is to look at what your policy actually says, or get guidance from somebody who looks at policies for a living. We've got a really great group here at Offitt Kerman that just focuses on helping policyholders in getting policies to pay out. And I've sent quite a few of my clients over to that group over the past couple of weeks. And some of them have had success. Like the insurance company comes back and says, oh no, this is pandemic related, it's not covered. But if you actually read the terms of the insurance policy, it should have been covered. So we've been able to, you know, help them navigate that situation. It's incredibly frustrating, though. And I would suggest that before you sign any policies that are coming up in the future, if you've got a renewal period, double check, because there have been some discussions of people, they just sign like, oh, same policy as last year, and didn't realize that, in January, some of these insurers were excluding specifically COVID-19 pandemic related events because they had seen what was going on in China and anticipated that it would be an issue here down the road. And it's incredibly frustrating for a small business owner to go to their insurance, holder and say, hey, I have this policy, I've been paying for it, I actually need to use it now. And then to find out that the, one thing, because there was a slight change in wording, has completely exempted them from being able to make a claim. So definitely double check. If you need somebody to look at it, get professional advice on it. Your broker, your local agent and broker wants to help you out, but sometimes their hands are tied and you need to go outside of that relationship. So then again, review your insurance policies. You jumped me ahead to partway through where I was going with this slide, and see if you need to make a claim. And if you do and you haven't yet, make one now, don't wait, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be for you to get coverage if it is allowed. And then stepping back just slightly, you want to look at your staffing and your operations for the company. And Veronica is going to dig into this more deeply as we move forward, but what standards are you going to have for your staffing, now and then coming back? And how are your needs going to differ? If there were things that you could have canceled over the past couple of months, could you have gotten a break on them? If you have a regular coffee delivery to the office and nobody's there, those are things that you could have, potentially canceled or put on hold. So save money by, looking at the non-essentials that go into the day-to-day for an office, and then negotiate with your vendors and partners where you can. Call people up if you don't need something right now. If you've got a standing order, a lot of businesses are in this position and everybody's trying to work together. But if you do make an amendment to an agreement that you have, make sure that you have it in writing. You don't want to have somebody come back to you after the fact and say, oh no, I'm pretty sure we agreed that it was going to be X when you thought it was Y. I had a client just the other week who had negotiated with her landlord to pay rent a little late, and they came back and the written agreement that they provided didn't match the time frame that she had agreed to on the phone. And she called them out on it, and their response was, well, this is what we're comfortable with. And so, if she had just moved forward with a handshake instead of asking for that written agreement, it would have been a very different situation down the road. And without a piece of paper, it's very hard to defend your case if you have to go to court over it. It becomes a he said, she said, and that's not helpful for anybody. So let me trying to move forward.
So, I'll start while we're waiting for the next slide, but it's the practical pointer number 2 is to stay informed. And I know we're all trying to do this, but it might make sense to be even more diligent about it, because as we edge towards the initial phases of reopening, it's going to be important that we're able to comprehend and collect all of the guidance and laws that are out there. So depending on the size of your organization, you might want to designate a team, whether that's one person or several people, to help keep you and your employees informed. It also makes sense to have regular check-ins with that team or some key employees, just to see how things are going. How will this work on the ground level? What did you hear? Maybe someone read something that's relevant that you hadn't heard. So you want to make sure you're having communication. And then I would recommend keeping a form of meeting minutes. It doesn't have to be as formal as, a board meeting, but by having a record of what you discussed, you can, one, look back on it. Maybe you discussed something that's going to be useful down the road, and it was a good idea that you want to revisit. Maybe it's to look back and say, hey, look, we were talking about implementing these strategies, and then the following week we issued a policy for best good hygiene practices in the office, and you can back yourself up by having these written minutes. Also, as you get the information and respond to it, it would be helpful to communicate that to your employees and your potential clients and customers, because that will really instill a sense of confidence in them and show that you're really keeping up to date with what's going on. So we've put together a list of some resources that we have found really helpful, and that you should have that individual or team check in, even if it's just a quick search in the morning, or maybe a couple times a week, so you can see if there's been any updates. That would be really smart. Governor Hogan's website's great. It has all of the standing orders passed and the ones that are still in effect for you to kind of look at. And then if you miss a press release, like there was one yesterday at 3 p.m., if you miss it, they're posted to the website and you can go and check back and see what was discussed. Another great resource is the EEOC webpage, which is providing guidance with the traditional and employment laws relating to discrimination, how to navigate that. And it's also being updated pretty regularly. And if something turned out to be not great guidance, they're going back and fixing it. So definitely check there. And then the CDC, I think we've all been looking at that to keep up to date with the coronavirus symptoms, which is going to be really important as we start to reopen, to educate yourselves and your employees, which we'll talk about a little further in the presentation. But it also identifies higher risk individuals and provides guidance for specific industries. So definitely worth checking that. And then also OSHA, they've been providing guidance for keeping a safe and healthy workplace in light of the pandemic. So I would suggest looking at those. And I think Kelsey's going to talk to you about the rest.
Yeah, I think a lot of local businesses don't think about looking at the World Health Organization for business guidance, but they have some really good resources on there. It mirrors a lot of what's going on with the CDC, but if you do work with any other companies in other parts of the world, understanding what's happening and as restrictions get lifted elsewhere, how that might impact your own supply chain, I think is a very important part of keeping informed. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, is of course the resource for anybody that has applied for a PPP loan or the economic impact loans. So these are all things that we're still getting guidance on. There's not been regulations that have come out officially, but they keep sending out press releases with frequently asked questions and some interpretations as to what is actually going to happen with repayment and obligations with regards to that. So if you haven't gotten a loan yet, or if you have and you're not sure whether or not you can use it for your intended purpose, that's a good gatekeeper for you. And then lastly, the IRS's website. I think one of the things a lot of businesses and individuals don't realize is that there are tax breaks that were built into the CARES Act. So it's not just, you get this one-time stimulus payment where there's this, loan that you've taken out. There are other ways that the government has tried to give businesses relief by helping them to, cap certain things that they didn't cap previously, or remove caps from certain things. So, that plus your accountant is going to get you to a good spot for when you're planning your tax returns for next year and you're trying to figure out, what has happened this year with regards to our books.
So practical pointer number 3 is to implement written policies in response to the coronavirus. And I think from an employment perspective, this is probably one of the biggest practical pointers that you can do. The goals of the policy should be to ultimately prevent the spread of COVID-19 by lessening the risk of exposure in the workplace. It also sets very clear standards for your management and employees, that this is how we're going to operate and this is how we're going to protect against the virus. and get receipts. Make sure, just like with your handbooks, how we do an employee acknowledgement receipt, you should get that for each policy, or for each policy that you put out there, because this is really important that employees understand what's expected of them. And then those receipts, having the policies in place, having dates on those policies to show when they were in place will protect against potential legal disputes, as any employment policy would. So I have listed here some policies for your consideration. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and depending on the specific operations of your business, you may think of other ones to include. Some may not apply, and others might be spot on, but these are the types of policies that you should really be considering now and as we move forward. So policies that reduce the risk of exposure. Now, this could be one really big comprehensive policy, or it could be a bunch of smaller policies like you might see in a handbook. But some of the salient points that I think you should address are, number one, good hygiene. And this is where, looking at the CDC and OSHA websites will help. But frequent hand washing, coughing, sneezing etiquette, no personal contact, the handshake, unfortunately, may be gone for a while, if not forever. But really limiting elbow bump. So limiting physical contact, and then also limit the sharing of office equipment. So if you have to share office equipment, you should have some policy saying that everyone should use disinfectant after that communal equipment is used. And then proper use of trash bins, not leaving things out on your desk for too long. And these may seem like very basic rules that we all should already know to follow. But now with the spread of coronavirus, it's really important that these rules are in writing.
Veronica, I have
sure.
a question.
Yeah.
Because we over the last several weeks have been trying to put together a plan for when we return to work. And the one question that we have is that, are employers, are they legally required to provide face coverings to its employees?
So that has not been mandated yet, but I definitely think it's something to consider moving forward, and it's going to be a very good practice. And one reason you might want to provide them is if you just have employees bringing in their own face coverings, let's say they've been used multiple times and they're not following the CDC, and it's a dirty mask and essentially is useless to prevent sickness. If that mask is contaminated, they could claim, I got sick at work, while really it's using, not a clean mask. If you decide to have people bring in their own face coverings, you may want to have extra masks on hand in case someone forgets it at home. But we're seeing that, Hogan's April 15 order required retailers to provide physical distancing, the tape on the floor at the grocery store. They must provide hand sanitizer. So we're seeing orders coming out that are making some requirements, but at this time, face masks haven't been required that employers provide them. But if that does become an issue, I think employers have to worry about the supply and demand issues. Plan ahead. When are we going to get in the next shipment? Who's a good vendor to get it from? I know there's been some fraud out there with getting PPE equipment. So you really want to plan for that, and then also do a cost benefit analysis. How much is this going to cost us? Are we going to get N95 masks? Are we going to get surgical masks? What makes the most sense for our business? So that's a good point, Mike. That's definitely something that we'll see if it's going to be required, along with hand sanitizer, tissues, individual trash bins, regularly keeping the soap in place, and scheduled regular cleanings. Like, these may be things that you have to consider when we start moving towards reopening.
Veronica, do you advise that businesses that allow employees to bring in their own masks quote guidelines as to what those masks look like, whether it be the N95 or a surgical mask? Or I'm sure you've seen, when you've gone out to the grocery store, I've seen some very fancy masks with people showing some personality with them. teeth on them and, things like that.
Or the
do you recommend-
bandanas.
or the bandanas, or, things that are, very political, shall we say.
Yeah, I think company culture is going to play a big factor into it. And if you want to keep, I know some offices do casual Fridays or certain things like that. Having that in writing, again, sets the expectations for the employees. Kelsey just came up with a slew of different types of face coverings. And then also you want to make sure you're recommending the face covering that's appropriate for the risk at work. So that's a great, I think, being very specific in the policies and using, face covering that has a definition now. So making sure you're working within the confines and being very specific. Physical distancing, I think that's an obvious one that's going to continue for who knows how long. So you want to start considering, are we going to limit the number of employees that are using communal areas? Are we going to get rid of the communal areas completely? What steps do we have to implement to achieve physical distancing? Is that changing around furniture, removing furniture from some places, or requiring employees to work from home? So I think these are all considerations. And like I said, that this can be a comprehensive policy. I just named several things that you might have to lay out for your employees. So thinking about what works best for you. So my second category is reporting COVID-19 related symptoms. I think this is really important. You have to train your employees to identify these COVID symptoms, which have changed since January 31, when we first learned about the virus. I also would recommend establishing a reporting plan. So not only encouraging self-reporting and telling employees to stay home if they feel sick, but also teaching your managers and supervisors and other employees how to recognize the symptoms and then who to report it to avoid confronting the possible potential sick employee and having an issue with that at work. Work from home policies, I think this is also really critical so that everybody understands what their duties are when they're at home. The plan should lay out who's eligible, what equipment will be provided by the company, how to keep company information confidential and secure, password protection and things like that, depending on the sensitivities of your business. Even what safety precautions to take while they're at home. And then very importantly, tracking their time. You might want to have them do timesheets, or if you have the virtual clock-in, that's great too. And you also may want to consider them certifying that these are the hours that I worked. And this is to protect against Fair Labor Standard Act and state wage and hour claims, because those are, as we're going to talk a little bit later, very costly. Similar to working from home, travel policies, if you have restrictions in place or if restrictions are being lifted, setting out those expectations for the employees. And then this is a big one because it's impacting us right now, are setting up leave guidelines for the new sick and safe leave and extended FMLA. So I think you want to make sure that these policies track the law and emphasize who is eligible and what the benefits will be. I think you also want to distinguish these types of benefits that are coronavirus related separate from your regular sick and safe leave policy and how it interacts with the traditional FMLA leave policy. So having these policies, I think, will also help buttress the employer's understanding of what the requirements are, but also making it very clear for your employees. And so we've actually worked with clients to provide written leave request forms that now reflect the reasons why you might be eligible for these types of leave. Returning to work after illness. I think this is definitely something to think about. Are you going to make your employees provide a doctor's note? Are you going to require that they submit to a medical exam? Are you going to institute the 14-day symptom-free policy before returning to work. I think these are all really important considerations. And along that same vein of keeping employees healthy when they return to work, what precautions are you going to take when they come to enter the workplace? We've heard about taking temperatures, asking the coronavirus related symptoms inquiries. And I would recommend if you're taking temperatures and recording it, if you're asking these symptom related questions, I would make a script so that everybody's asking the same question over and over and everyone knows what to expect. And if you're documenting this information, you've got to keep it confidential. Those laws still apply, and you got to keep it separate. I think some of you've seen the EEOCs recently said that employers can do COVID testing on their employees. I think when you're thinking about that, you have to consider the reliability of the test, who are qualified vendors for the test, where are you going to get these tests from? Also the reliability in the respect that you can get false positives, false negatives, and it's only testing for that specific time where you're administering the test. It's not gonna give you, oh, they're good for a week. So you gotta measure out the cost benefit analysis there. I would also, update existing policies that you may have to the extent they need to be. And then just general reminders. I already mentioned this, but confidentiality of health records. Make sure you're applying these policies in a fair and non-discriminatory way. If you are attaching discipline to any of these policies, which is completely warranted, make sure you're providing a written explanation as to why the discipline is needed in the policy. So it's right there for everyone to see. And then with the updates, like in the continual changes, I would include something saying, if there's conflicting guidance from any of the health authorities, that guidance supersedes this policy. And also, this is anything that changes in state and federal local law that will take control and precedence over the policy, just to build in some wiggle room there. And we talked about using clear definitions in the policies. And then I would also establish a point person who you can say, Mike Camerata is going to handle all of your questions. Please see him. And just so there's a clear path where these inquiries can go.
And Veronica, I do have a question for you.
Sure.
So for the employers that have yet to put, policies like that in place, is it too late?
It's never too late to put a good policy in place. And it's also a chance to document what you've been doing right. Let's put our practice that we've been doing correctly in writing, or it's a chance to fix what you may have been doing wrong. So definitely not too soon to start. And these policies can always be tweaked as we learn more. And if you have any questions, we're available to review those policies for you.
Okay, so the next practical pointer that we have is to document everything. I think you've heard us say this at least 6 times already. Keep receipts, keep copies of things. Just as a general list, any employee documents. So if you have employees who let you know that they're having difficulty working from home for one reason or another, or they need, amended hours because they have childcare concerns, keep copies of that. Employees who let you know that they're sick, keep copies of that. You may have reporting duties down the road where if one employee comes in and later tests positive and everybody else in the office has been exposed, you may need to provide information with regards to exposure risk. Any insurance claims, any documents related to your insurance claim, you're going to need to prove to the insurance company, presuming that you have coverage, that your expenses are what they are. So, if you are not keeping track of the losses that you suffered or the days that you were shut down or things like that, now is a good time to kind of go back and figure out, what do I need to keep as a paper trail to show that this has been an ongoing loss, that it was a serious issue for my bottom line. And then banking documents, if you've applied for a loan or if you might be applying for a loan, you want to keep copies of all of these. There will be certification processes where those companies that have received government assistance through the SBA loans are going to have to show that they use the funds in certain ways, that they, actually applied the way that they should have, that, ownership of the company meets certain tests. So these are all things that you're going to need to prove down the road and to show that, yeah, I threw this application together and I can actually, document for the powers that be that I met the minimum criteria to apply for this loan in the first place, because otherwise you're looking at potential bank fraud and nobody wants to have to deal with that. And then any amendments to your contracts, I said this earlier, if you make agreements with your third parties, be it your landlord or somebody that you're supposed to be performing a service for or an event for, get it in writing. It's much better to have a formal contract amendment instead of just like an email agreeing to XYZ, because you want to make sure that whomever is signed off on the dotted line actually has the authority to make an amendment to that agreement. On the other side, you might always be dealing with the same person in sales, but that person may not have the right on behalf of the company to make changes to the contracts that you had in place. You might need to get a sign off from somebody higher up the food chain, so to speak.
And just before we leave documentation, as Kelsey was saying, the PPP is requiring certification for that you took the loan, you filled out the loan and have requested it in good faith. And I think that foreshadows that they're probably going to be looking for documentation for the forgiveness as well.
Yeah.
And so you want to make sure you're really creating an organized accounting of where the expenditures are going. And even if you can categorize further, was this a payroll cost or was this an other cost? And make sure it's fitting into that framework, and keep your supporting documents. And then just on May 5th, some new guidance came out about the forgiveness calculation. And this plays with documentation as well, because it basically said, if you laid off an employee and asked them back in writing and they decline your offer, that will not reduce your forgiveness in the calculation for not having that employee back on your payroll. And they've said very specifically that this has to be a written offer of rehire, and you have to show in writing that they declined to come back to work. So just another point that as this new guidance comes out, because you're staying informed, there might be more documentation requirements.
Okay, so practical pointer number 5 is really divided into 2 separate categories. Both of them are liability risks. Veronica is going to talk with you first about the liability that comes up with COVID-19 specifically, and then I'm going to address some issues with business adaptation and how businesses may have changed what they're doing over the past few weeks, but they may not have identified things that they need to shore up to make sure that they're not risking exposure elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think it's too soon to tell exactly all of the potential claims that might be out there regarding liability to business owners, but we've identified a few here, and I'm going to walk through them just so you're aware of what's out there and what to be wary of. But the FLSA and Maryland wage and hour claims, this involves minimum wage, overtime, and the payment of wages. And these carry very hefty penalties over a mistake that you might have made and not even realized. Employees that make claims like this, if they can prove that they had some, in violation of these policies, they're entitled to double the wages. And if they can prove that the employer knew that they were in violation, they could sometimes be allowed up to triple damages. DC is an automatic 4 times damages, so plus attorney's fees for both DC and Maryland. So these quickly become very expensive claims. So it's important to make sure your employees are tracking their time. I think that's extremely important, especially when they're working from home. You also want to look at your own internal PTO and vacation policies. With furloughs and terminations happening, you have to make sure that you're complying with your own policies. So Maryland does not require that you have PTO or vacation policies that are paid or of any kind. But if you have a paid policy and upon resignation or termination, you have a payout provision, you need to comply with that, because that's considered wages and can be a violation of the FLSA or the Maryland, it would be the Maryland Wage and Payment Collection Act. Discrimination, we kind of touched on this before. The EEOC has put out a statement on national origin and race harassment and discrimination as a result of the coronavirus. So you should check that out. All traditional employment laws still apply. So I think that's important to make sure if you don't have a policy in place now, it's not too late, put it in place and have a good reporting system for harassment and discrimination.
Veronica, can I ask
Sure.
a question? Within that, there's also concerns, I don't know if this is a question so much as a statement, but there are concerns with face masks being inadequate if you have facial hair. I know a lot of guys are rocking the Corona beard right now, but for some religious groups, that is part of their religious identity, is having certain facial hair or, the other things that could get in the way of an effective face mask. So what are you telling employers to do with regards to those types of policies?
I think you should definitely take a look at the EEOC guidance, and you can put something in there. If you need a specific accommodation, please contact supervisor or manager, and you can address that with them and see if it can be, if there's a reasonable accommodation available. But the EEOC has made it very clear that you can put in place these safety precautions, and it's not going to be a violation of the discrimination law. So definitely check out those FAQs, because again, they're being updated pretty regularly. With furloughs and layoffs, you want to make sure you're using objective criteria to do that, and be very thoughtful about the decisions that you're making there. This is interesting. The wrongful death and personal injury claims are definitely making headlines. I'm sure you saw the Walmart news that an employee's family was suing Walmart for his death from coronavirus. And these claims are popping up despite the general rule that these claims should be covered exclusively by the workers' comp framework. So even though that these are coming up, I mean, there's fallout from bad press, giving the community the sense that you did something wrong. So there's bad publicity associated with it. And having these good policies and procedures is a great way to prevent those types of lawsuits from happening and keeping your employees safe. Another thought, I don't think we've seen this, attorneys are talking about it. I'm not sure if we've seen it put into practice yet, but using liability waivers with third parties coming onto your property, we'll have to see whether that's going to be a violation of public policy to exclude that type of liability for negligence relating to the coronavirus. It's very fact specific. So again, that's something if you're considering, we can definitely discuss further. Another interesting thought is Maryland is a contributory negligence state. There's only 4 of those in the country: Maryland, Virginia, DC, and Alabama, that still recognize that if the other party is 1% at fault, you have no recovery. And so that might be an interesting concept that comes into play along with the defense of you assume the risk. You knew that coronavirus is a potential risk. You didn't follow the policy or the order to wear your mask or follow certain social distancing. Are you assuming the risk of getting sick? So that's just another concept I think that we can start thinking about. With regard to the workers' compensation claims, I think we're going to see an uptick of these as well. I just checked the Maryland Workers' Comp website, and they've delayed hearings through June 5th. So there's going to be a slow up in that process as well. But whether the exposure was caused by the employee's work will be very difficult, I think, for the employee to prove with how pervasive coronavirus has been. So some things that might increase their success of a workers' comp claim might be the type of work that they're doing, like a first responder or a medical worker. And then if they can identify a specific instance that happened at work where a bunch of people got sick, or, you know, so-and-so company knew that this person was sick and they weren't employing proper procedures, that might help with their workers' comp claim. The WARN Act, I think you should just be aware of it. It applies to employers with 100 employees, and it's basically if there's a plant closing or a mass layoff that affects 50 or more employees, it triggers a notice requirement that you have to let them know that that's going to happen. And there's penalties associated with violating that. On a smaller scale, Maryland does require 1 pay period's notice if you're going to reduce an employee's pay. So that is like a Maryland specific rule. And I think in this time, it's very important to be aware of. If a lawsuit's filed, you should notify counsel right away and any potential insurance carriers. If you have an EPLI carrier, definitely put them on notice to see if you have coverage.
So, Veronica, I have a question. What if you have an employee who is just refusing to come to work because they are too scared? Does the employer have the right to terminate that employee?
So this is a big question that's been coming up, and I think the answer is generally yes. You know, Maryland's an at-will state for employment, and if your employee doesn't want to come to work, you're within your right to terminate them. But I think it's important to first make sure that they have no legal justification for their fear. So you should consider, do they need a reasonable accommodation? Are they a high risk employee that might need a reasonable accommodation? So to go through that interactive process if necessary. Is their leave covered under Families First? And then make sure there's no reason for there to be a claim relating to OSHA. So is there any reason for them to believe that your work environment is unsafe? And again, the policies and following through on those policies and procedures will help protect against that.
So then the next thing we wanted to address are business adaptation liability risks, which I've identified as the things businesses are doing to stay nimble during the pandemic and, you know, try to figure out ways that they can stay viable. So, you know, what have you done differently as a company, whether it's having people work from home or if you're a restaurant changing to a delivery only model that changes the way that you have done business as usual? And what could that potentially trigger for you down the road? So if I own a restaurant and I have employees who used to only work, you know, front of the house, and now I have them out there making deliveries, you know, is there car insurance in place for the business? I can almost guarantee that that employee's personal car insurance will not cover an accident that they have while they're driving, you know, for work. So you will need to make sure that there's, you know, coverage there. The last thing that anybody wants to see have happen is, you know, there's a, you know, employee who's on the road, runs over a pedestrian, or, you know, runs into somebody who's walking their dog or something like that, and then there be a lawsuit against your already struggling restaurant because of this. So look at the things that you're doing differently and figure out whether or not you have the appropriate coverage in place. Not just, you know, driver's insurance, but workers' compensation insurance. If employees are working from home, you may have different requirements. If employees live in another state and they're working from home now, that may trigger other things for you. You may have to get out workers' comp coverage in, you know, Pennsylvania if they're over the state line, because they are a Pennsylvania, resident who's working for you in another state. You may have to pay taxes differently with regards to, the income tax that's going to be allocated to, those employees at the end of the year. So these are things that you need to think about on a ongoing basis, and try to be proactive about getting things in place now instead of waiting for an actual issue to pop up down the road. I think also there was a tendency at the beginning of this, when everything but essential businesses were shut down, for some companies to try to redefine who they are and what they do, which could be more damaging down the road. An example that I've used before is a yoga studio that I went to was sending out emails saying that they have suddenly decided that they are no longer a yoga studio, they are a broadcasting station. Mike's making the same face that I made, which was, okay, so you're doing, all of your classes online right now, but that doesn't mean that you are a broadcasting station. There's licensing that goes into becoming a broadcasting station. And those penalties for operating a broadcasting station without the appropriate license are going to be a heck of a lot more than the penalties that you would have, or the losses that you're going to suffer from being shut down for a couple of months. And, if you've done things to try to stay open, you may not be able to make claims for business interruption if you are, otherwise completely shut down, but you're trying to, figure out some patchwork of ways to stay open. So you may be invalidating any claims that you have with your insurance that you have in place. So just try to be critical in your thoughts about every decision that you make for the business. Everybody wants to be quick and reactive so that they can stay open and be viable, but you don't want to create more problems for yourself down the road. So I try to swap slides. It's a very, very slow response. I'm so sorry.
I think our next,
There we go.
There we go.
So the next practical pointer we have is to plan ahead. So again, you've already evaluated where you're at now and what you're, going to be doing to navigate the ongoing day-to-day of the pandemic. But down the road, eventually we will be outside of the COVID-19 pandemic world. So a couple of things that you can do, I've completely lifted these from an article from the Harvard Business Review, but I thought it was really useful. Identify your position and understand where you are in a post-pandemic world. It's going to be different than you were in a pre-pandemic world. If you've evolved your business model, if you have changed, what you're manufacturing to adapt to this situation, how's that going to play out after we have this resolved? And then plan. What can you do today to prepare for tomorrow? We've been very reactive. We've been living in the moment and trying to, keep up with everything and deal with it as it comes, to us. But we can't constantly be reactive. We have to be proactive about what we do when we come back. Employment policies, or how your business is going to function, how you're going to do marketing in the future. Social distancing continues on. A lot of the networking events that we've seen in the past are not going to exist in the same form. So how do you get out there to make sales calls? How do you get out there to meet new people who are potential business referrals? And then perspective, what's the impact on your corporate culture from this? Every business is impacted differently. As we know, those of us that have been able to work from home are, plugging along with, some interruptions in our daily work life, but not nearly as many as people who, say, work in a hair salon. What is it going to look like for them to come back and have to, wear full face masks and, maybe wear gloves for everything that they do? How's that going to, affect the mental health of the people who work for you? And, perhaps you need to do some team building or things like that to try to reinvigorate a sense of community within, your own workspace. And then do projects, plan for the initiatives that are important to you. Be very protective of your resources. We're going to have an economic downturn for a while. So things that were maybe, less important, but, interesting projects, maybe those get shelved for a while. Maybe we reevaluate what our priorities are with regards to what needs to get done versus what we want to get done, and apply your resources accordingly. And then be prepared. Figure out, are you prepared to tackle what's next? Are you, ready to come back? Are you ready for a second wave? If that happens, what could you have done differently this time around that would make that second wave a easier transition for you as a business?
And I think we can, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I just have a quick point. Okay.
No, so and I know we're running short on time here. Your last slide, there were a lot of P's on that slide.
Yes.
And I have a question that I think a lot of employers have, and this is regarding the PPP loan. So
Okay.
we just got approved, thankfully, this week for the PPP loan.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people want to know, do we use it all on staffing and payroll, or, talking about like strategic planning ahead, can I use it for other things, other improvements or needs that our business has?
Okay, so the PPP loan was intended to be paycheck protection for employees who can't work. That being said, a lot of businesses are looking at, well, what if we're shut down for more than the amount of time that the PPP loan is going to cover? If I bring people back and I pay them for 2 months and then I have to fire them again, what's that going to mean, down the road? I think for most businesses, it's going to have to be a very personal decision, and that you need to look at, where your finances are and where do you need to be in 6 months or a year, and figure out what a nice balance is. Do you use some of it for the paycheck protection, knowing that you're going to have to, convert it otherwise, or, it's going to be a on the ground decision, and every business is going to have a different outcome with it. I think, these loans were not intended to be banked for a rainy day, because I know that there are some companies that have been criticized for, well, you've already got, all of these investors, especially with some startups, and that you got this money and you're just sitting on it for some other project that you want to do a year from now. I don't know if that's going to meet the certification tests down the road when the government comes to look at what you use these funds for. It's a evolving situation with regards to that, but it was intended to be used to keep your business afloat during the short term. Use it for short term goals. Don't use it because that's money that I can put towards building out a new wing of the store in a year. That's not what it was given out for. So, and if you've got questions about it, we're always happy to talk with business owners and help them figure out what the best strategy is for that. So.
Yeah, because I'll just add, 75% of that is supposed to be used for payroll costs. 25% are other costs, which you can find the definition of that all over the place. But I think it's important to decide, I think a lot of companies are saying, how can we jam all of this in and get our employees back to get forgiveness? And I think you got to think about, does forgiveness make sense for my business, or are we going to have a cash flow again in 8 weeks? So yeah, as Kelsey said, I think there's a lot that goes into deciding how you want to use that money.
Or, if the employees that you have currently are employees that are going to stick around in 8 weeks, if you've got a business that is very transient to begin with, maybe you don't want to try to, keep people paid during that period of time. You are going to roll the dice and see if you can get new staff down the road. What does that mean for your corporate culture too? Is that even something you want to consider? Because it might mean that you don't have a lot of loyalty after the fact. So it's a lot of factors that go into making that decision.
So I think here's just a quick list of our 6 practical pointers. And the next slide has a link for Offutt Kerman's resources. And I think this is a good place for you to check out as well, because we're a full service firm. So we have attorney, like Kelsey and I have very different practices. And, you know, we have tax people, we have real estate, family law attorneys, and they're keeping up with COVID as well, and how that, how it's impacting those fields also. So you can get updates on there. And I know
Got
we
a
kind
divide
of
and conquer strategy. So we each narrowed in our own practice areas and trying to keep on top of everything, and then sharing resources as we need to.
And I know we've run, you know, right to our time today, but please feel free to look up me or Kelsey on the web and email us any questions that you might have had throughout the presentation. I'd be happy, and I know Kelsey would be too, to answer them for you.
Yeah. So at this time, for those in the attendance here, if you do have questions for us, please submit them at this time. One question, will this webinar be on the Offutt Kerman website?
I think we can arrange for
I
that.
think we can make that
I
happen.
don't see why not. And I think it will also be distributed by the chamber. If you were signed up and attended, you should get a copy of it by email, right, Mike?
I believe so, yeah. Well, great. It doesn't look like there's any further questions. Ladies, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having us.
This great content. For all of you out there, stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see all of you soon at some point in person.
Thanks for
Thank
joining.
you.
Yep.
Have a great day, everybody.
Take care, everyone.